The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore room cast a shimmering net over the diners, each prism refracting the muted conversations and the clinking of silverware against fine china. A low hum of polite chatter filled the space, a soundtrack to the delicate dance of servers navigating the crowded room. Malcolm moved through this orchestrated chaos with an almost preternatural grace, his movements economical yet fluid, a silent symphony of anticipation. He knew the rhythm of the room, the subtle cues that signaled a need before it was voiced, a slight shift in posture, a fleeting glance toward an empty water glass, the almost imperceptible twitch of a hand reaching for a non-existent breadstick. Years of navigating this world, this delicate ecosystem of wealth and expectation, had honed his senses, transforming him into a phantom presence, seen but not truly noticed. He refilled a wine glass, the pale golden liquid catching the light, a fleeting moment of beauty in the midst of the mundane. As he moved towards the kitchen, a melody, a remnant of a childhood lullaby his grandmother used to sing, unconsciously escaped his lips, a soft, barely audible hum. It was a melody of resilience, woven from the threads of hardship and hope, a private sanctuary he carried within him. He hadn't realized the melody had found its way out, hadn't registered its presence in the opulent air of the Whitmore room until a voice, laced with amusement and a certain condescending edge, cut through the hushed ambience. Well, didn't know we had live entertainment tonight." Malcolm stiffened, the melody dying in his throat like a trapped bird. He turned, his gaze meeting the source of the comment, Charles Wentworth III, Newport Beach royalty, draped in an impeccably tailored suit, a smirk playing on his lips. Malcolm recognized him, of course. Everyone in Newport Beach knew Charles Wentworth III. He was a fixture at the Whitmore room, a man who seemed to exist solely to remind everyone else of their place in the hierarchy. Malcolm's place, as he was being reminded now, was firmly at the bottom. A wave of heat washed over Malcolm, a familiar blend of anger and resignation. He had learned to navigate these encounters, to absorb the subtle jabs and veiled insults like a seasoned boxer rolling with the punches. He told himself it was the price of admission to this world, the cost of earning a living in this gilded cage. Yet, a flicker of something else, a spark of defiance, ignited within him. He met Wentworth's gaze, his own expression carefully neutral. "Just a hum, sir," he replied, his voice calm even. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Wentworth chuckled, a sound that grated on Malcolm's nerves. "A hum, you say? Sounds almost musical. Perhaps we have a hidden virtuoso in our midst." He gestured towards the grand piano nestled in the corner of the room, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light. "Why don't you give us a performance, my good man? Entertain us." The amusement in his voice was now edged with something sharper, a cruel glint in his eyes. Malcolm's stomach clenched. He hadn't touched a piano in years. The memories, once a source of comfort, now felt like a phantom limb, a constant reminder of what he had lost, what he had been forced to leave behind. He could feel the weight of the room's attention shifting towards him, a mixture of curiosity and morbid fascination. He saw the other diners, their faces a mosaic of expressions, some amused, some uncomfortable, some simply indifferent. He saw his fellow waiters, their faces etched with a silent empathy, a shared understanding of the power dynamics at play. He knew what Wentworth wanted. He wanted a spectacle, a public display of humiliation, a reaffirmation of his own superiority. He wanted to reduce Malcolm to a caricature, a performing monkey for his amusement. 1,000 different responses flashed through Malcolm's mind. He could refuse, politely but firmly, citing his duties. He could apologize, feign ignorance, play the role of the subservient waiter. He could even walk away, abandon the pretense of civility altogether. Each option felt like a defeat, a concession to the unspoken rules of this world. Then something shifted within him. A quiet resolve settled in the pit of his stomach, a strength he hadn't realized he possessed. He looked at Wentworth, his gaze steady, and a slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of amusement. nor was it a smile of subservience. It was a smile of understanding, of acceptance, of quiet power. "Very well, sir," he said, his voice calm and clear. "If you insist." The room fell silent. The air crackled with anticipation. Wentworth's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. He had gotten what he wanted. He had his spectacle. Malcolm walked toward the piano, his steps measured, his back straight. He felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken expectations, the silent judgment. He reached the piano and paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and in that moment, he was no longer a waiter in a Newport Beach restaurant. He was a musician, a storyteller, a conduit for the melodies that flowed through his veins. He opened his eyes and began to play. The music that poured from the piano was unlike anything the patrons of the Whitmore Room had ever heard. It wasn't the polite, predictable background music they were accustomed to. It was raw, powerful, infused with a depth of emotion that resonated through the room. It was the music of his grandmother's lullaby, transformed, amplified, imbued with the weight of his experiences, his struggles, his triumphs. It was a lament, a celebration, a defiance. The notes danced in the air, weaving a tapestry of sound that silenced the whispers, stilled the clinking silverware, and held the room captive. Malcolm played as if possessed, lost in the music, oblivious to the stunned faces around him. He poured his heart and soul into the performance, channeling the years of suppressed emotions, the unspoken words, the hidden dreams. He played for his grandmother, for the memories of a life left behind, for the dignity he had been denied. As the last note faded into the silence, the room remained suspended, caught in the lingering echo of the music. Then, slowly, tentatively, applause erupted. It started as a ripple, then swelled into a wave, washing over Malcolm, a tangible expression of appreciation, of respect, of awe. He looked up, his eyes meeting Wentworth's. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, a flicker of something that resembled fear. The power dynamic had shifted, the tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. The jester had become the king. Malcolm offered a slight bow, a quiet acknowledgement of the applause, and then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving Charles Wentworth III and the rest of the Whitmore Room to grapple with the echoes of his performance, the lingering resonance of a melody that had exposed their shallowness, their pretense, their emptiness. The phantom had become real. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Room cast a shimmering, almost glacial light across the pristine white tablecloths. A low hum of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of silverware against fine china, filled the air. Malcolm moved through the space with practiced ease, his tray held aloft like an offering, his expression carefully neutral. He'd mastered the art of invisibility, of blending into the opulent background, a skill honed over years of navigating spaces where he was meant to be seen but not heard. Tonight, however, the air felt different, charged with a static tension he couldn't quite place. He could feel the weight of eyes, not just the usual cursory glances of diners checking on their orders, but something more pointed, more expectant. He reached table 6, where Charles Wentworth III sat holding court, a man whose wealth radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Wentworth steepled his fingers, his diamond ring catching the light, a miniature supernova on his hand. "Another glass of Chateau Lafite, waiter," he commanded, his voice laced with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to instant obedience. Malcolm filled his glass, the dark red wine swirling like liquid ruby. He was about to move on, to retreat back into the comforting anonymity of the bustling room, when Wentworth's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the air. "Say, waiter," Wentworth began, a smirk playing on his lips. "Didn't your ancestors used to play for men like me?" He gestured vaguely towards the grand piano in the corner, its polished ebony gleaming under the soft lights. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications, with the weight of generations of injustice. Malcolm felt a cold, knot tighten in his stomach. He recognized the game, the thinly veiled attempt to reduce him, to turn him into a spectacle for Wentworth's amusement. He wanted to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't heard, to disappear back into the rhythm of the evening. Just walk away, a voice whispered in his head. It's not worth it. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the way Wentworth's eyes glittered with a predatory gleam, the way his companions, all mirror images of his entitled indifference, leaned in, anticipating a show. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. He met Wentworth's gaze, his own expression unreadable. The silence stretched, taut as a violin string. Around them, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. He could feel the curious stares of the other diners, the nervous glances of his fellow staff. They were all witnesses, complicit in this small, cruel drama. Well, Wentworth pressed, his voice dripping with condescension. Can you play, boy? Or are those nimble fingers only good for carrying trays? A ripple of uneasy laughter went through Wentworth's table. Malcolm's jaw clenched. The word boy, so casually, so deliberately used, struck a discordant chord within him. He thought of his grandmother, her hands callous from years of working the fields, hands that could coax music from the battered piano in their small living room. He thought of the hours he'd spent practicing, the melodies that had been his solace, his escape. He thought of the dreams he'd buried, the sacrifices he'd made. And in that moment, something shifted within him. The desire to disappear, to become invisible, was replaced by a quiet, burning resolve. He took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of expensive perfumes and aged wine. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a stillness in the eye of the storm. He was no longer just a waiter, an anonymous figure in the background. He was a man with a history, with a voice, with a story to tell. And he would tell it, not with words, but with the language he knew best, the language of music. Without a word, he turned and began walking towards the grand piano. Each step felt deliberate, measured, a silent repudiation of Wentworth's attempt to diminish him. The room seemed to tilt, the whispers and clinking silverware fading into the background as the piano loomed larger, its polished surface reflecting the ambient light like a dark mirror. He could feel Wentworth's eyes boring into his back, could sense the anticipation, the disbelief, the nascent flicker of unease that was beginning to replace the smug confidence on the man's face. He reached the piano and paused, his hand hovering over the keys. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him, letting the years of practice, of passion, of pain, rise to the surface. Then, he began to play. The notes, clear and resonant, filled the room, weaving a spell of unexpected beauty. He played a piece he hadn't played in years, a piece that held within it the echoes of his grandmother's laughter, the warmth of his childhood home, the bittersweet ache of dreams deferred. The music swelled and subsided, a torrent of emotion pouring forth from his fingertips. He played not for Wentworth, not for the curious onlookers, but for himself, for the part of him that had been silenced for too long. As he played, he saw a subtle shift in the room. The whispers died down, replaced by a hushed reverence. The clinking of silverware ceased. Even Wentworth seemed momentarily stunned, his arrogant facade crumbling under the weight of the unexpected performance. The initial amusement in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of confusion, then by a dawning realization that he had miscalculated, that he had underestimated the man he had sought to humiliate. The other diners, initially drawn in by the prospect of a spectacle, were now captivated by the music, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and admiration. The staff, his silent allies, stood frozen, their eyes filled with a shared understanding, a shared sense of triumph. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. Malcolm, the unseen waiter, became the center of attention, the master of the room, his music a silent rebuke to the arrogance and prejudice that had sought to confine him. The Whitmore room, a place of hushed elegance and unspoken hierarchies, became a concert hall, a stage for a single, powerful act of defiance. And in the silence that followed the final note, a new understanding settled over the room, fragile yet undeniable. The polished ebony gleamed under the soft, incandescent glow of the Whitmore room's chandeliers. Malcolm sat before the grand piano, the ivory keys a stark contrast against his dark skin. His fingers hovered just above, not quite touching, a tremor barely perceptible running through them. The silence that had fallen over the room was heavy, expectant, a tangible entity pressing down on him. He could feel the weight of 100 gazes, the collective breath held in anticipation. This wasn't the anonymity he craved, the invisibility he cultivated within these gilded walls. He was exposed, a specimen pinned under a microscope, his worth about to be judged by a man whose amusement stemmed from the perceived inferiority of others. Just play, he told himself, play and disappear. But the music within him, a restless spirit yearning for release, wouldn't allow such simple escape. Something lively, wouldn't you say? Charles Wentworth III's voice, slick with amusement, sliced through the quiet. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Lively. The word echoed in his mind, laced with a condescending sweetness that burned more than outright hostility. He could practically feel the man's gaze, dissecting him, already savoring the anticipated failure. He expects a stumble, a fumble, a confirmation of his prejudice. The thought sparked a flicker of defiance within him, a small ember glowing in the face of the suffocating tension. He closed his eyes, briefly, inhaling the faint scent of lilies and aged wood that permeated the Whitmore room, a familiar backdrop to so many evenings spent navigating the intricate dance of servitude. This evening, however, the familiar was tinged with a metallic tang of fear and something else, something akin to resolve. When he opened his eyes, the world seemed to sharpen. The ornate carvings on the piano's legs, the subtle shimmer of the wine glasses on the tables, the expectant faces blurring into a single entity of anticipation. He placed his fingers on the keys, the cool ivory a grounding sensation against his skin. The first notes emerged, hesitant at first, a delicate exploration of the melody forming in his mind. It wasn't the boisterous, flamboyant tune Charles likely expected. It began as a whisper, a low murmur of blues, a lament rising from the depths of his soul. The initial amusement on Charles's face began to fade, replaced by a flicker of confusion. His carefully crafted mask of nonchalance seemed to crack, revealing a glimpse of something uneasy beneath. He doesn't understand, Malcolm thought, a strange sense of calm washing over him as the music flowed through him. He doesn't understand the language of these keys, the stories they tell. The melody shifted, subtly weaving in threads of classical elegance, a complex counterpoint to the underlying blues. It was a fusion of worlds, a reflection of the man he was, the man hidden beneath the waiter's uniform. He wasn't just Malcolm, the server. He was Malcolm, the musician, the dreamer, the keeper of melodies. A hush had fallen over the restaurant, deeper than the initial silence. Forks clattered against plates, lay forgotten. Conversations dwindled to whispers, then ceased altogether. The clinking of ice in glasses, the muffled laughter from the bar, all faded away, swallowed by the music. Malcolm played, lost in the currents of his own creation, his fingers dancing over the keys with a newfound confidence. The music swelled, filling the opulent space with a raw, emotional power that transcended the stuffy atmosphere of the Whitmore room. He wasn't performing for Charles, not anymore. He was playing for himself, for the years spent honing his craft in the quiet solitude of his small apartment, for the dreams he kept tucked away in the corners of his heart. He saw glimpses of faces in the periphery of his vision, captivated, mesmerized. He saw the rigid lines of Charles's shoulders soften, his smug expression replaced by a look of stunned bewilderment. The triumph he felt wasn't a sharp, vindictive pleasure, but a quiet, profound sense of self-possession. He hears it now, Malcolm thought, a small smile playing on his lips. He hears the stories, the pain, the hope, the resilience. The music spoke a language that transcended words, a language that Charles Wentworth III, with all his wealth and privilege, could no longer dismiss. The final notes hung in the air, delicate, ethereal, before fading into the renewed silence. The silence, however, was different now. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of before. It was a silence filled with awe, a silence pregnant with unspoken emotions. Malcolm lifted his hands from the keys, the lingering warmth of the ivory still on his fingertips. He met Charles's gaze, and in those eyes he no longer saw amusement or condescension, but something akin to respect, perhaps even a flicker of understanding. The small ember of defiance within him had blossomed into a steady flame, warming him from the inside out. He had played his truth, and in doing so, he had shifted the power dynamic in the room, not through confrontation, but through the sheer force of his artistry. The air was thick with unspoken words, the residue of emotions stirred by the music. In that moment, Malcolm was no longer just a waiter in the Whitmore room. He was a force to be reckoned with. The final chord hung in the air, a shimmering ghost of sound, before dissolving into the stunned silence of the Whitmore room. Malcolm's fingers rested on the ivory keys, the faint tremor in them, the only outward sign of the emotional tempest raging within him. He bared a part of himself he'd kept hidden, a vulnerability offered up on a platter of forced performance. For a heartbeat, the silence stretched, thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket. Then it shattered. A single clap, hesitant and unsure, pierced the quiet. Then another, and another, until the room erupted in a wave of applause, a tidal surge of appreciation washing over Malcolm, leaving him breathless in its wake. He hadn't played for applause, hadn't sought this recognition. His performance had been an act of defiance, a reclamation of his dignity in the face of Charles Wentworth III's casual cruelty. Yet here it was, this unexpected validation, warming him from the inside out, a small, defiant flame against the chill of humiliation. Charles sat frozen, a statue carved from shock and disbelief. His face, usually so carefully arranged in an expression of amused superiority, was a mask cracked and crumbling. The smug glint in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a dull, flickering unease. He'd expected a stumble, a stammering performance, a confirmation of his own perceived superiority. Instead, he'd been confronted with raw talent, a power he couldn't comprehend, couldn't control. His carefully constructed world, where his wealth dictated the narrative, had been momentarily tilted off its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ashen and strangely diminished in the plush velvet chair. Around the room, faces reflected a spectrum of emotions. Some, the habitual sycophants, mirrored Charles's shock, their smiles faltering, unsure of how to react to this unexpected disruption of the established order. Others, perhaps those who'd witnessed similar displays of casual cruelty, wore expressions of quiet satisfaction, a subtle acknowledgement of the poetic justice unfolding before them. Malcolm's fellow waiters, silent observers on the periphery, exchanged knowing glances, their eyes conveying a shared understanding, a silent camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared experience. They had seen the subtle slights, the barely concealed disdain, the casual disregard for their presence. This small act of rebellion was a victory for them all. Malcolm, his heart still thrumming with the lingering echoes of the music, rose from the piano bench. The applause continued, a warm, enveloping sound, a balm to the raw edges of his exposed soul. He felt a strange detachment from the scene, as if observing himself from a distance. He was still Malcolm, the waiter, the invisible man in a starched white shirt. Yet he was also something more, something stronger, something Charles Wentworth III could never touch. He resumed his duties, the familiar routine a grounding force in the swirling aftermath of his performance. He collected empty glasses, refilled water goblets, his movements precise and economical, his face a carefully composed mask of professional detachment. Inside, However, the embers of defiance still glowed, warming him with a quiet satisfaction. "Remarkable," a woman's voice murmured nearby. Malcolm turned to see an elderly woman, her eyes twinkling with appreciation. "Absolutely remarkable." He inclined his head in acknowledgement, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. "Thank you, madam." The applause finally began to subside, leaving a hushed reverence in its wake. Charles cleared his throat, a feeble attempt to reclaim the narrative. "Still," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the clinking of silverware, "it's just a piano." A low chuckle rippled through the room, a quiet but potent dismissal of Charles's attempt to diminish the significance of what had just transpired. The chuckle seemed to hang in the air, a tangible representation of the shifting power dynamic. A young man, his face flushed with admiration, approached Malcolm. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Malcolm paused, a tray of dirty dishes balanced effortlessly on one hand. He considered the question, the weight of years of practice, of stolen moments at the keyboard, of a passion nurtured in the quiet hours between shifts. "Carrying trays," he replied, his voice soft but steady, "teaches you a thing or two about balance." The young man blinked, momentarily confused. Then a slow smile spread across his face as he grasped the layered meaning in Malcolm's words. The balance of a tray, the balance of a life lived on the periphery, the balance between defiance and dignity. The air in the Whitmore room had changed. The scent of expensive perfume and aged wine still lingered, but something else had been added, something intangible, something electric. It was the scent of defiance, the aroma of a spirit unbroken, a silent testament to the power of music and the resilience of the human heart. The final notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune faded into the hushed reverence of the Whitmore room. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, a stark contrast to the previous cacophony of clinking silverware and murmured conversations. A single spotlight remained on the grand piano, a gleaming ebony island in the opulent sea of white linen and crystal. Malcolm stood, bathed in its glow, his hands still hovering over the keys as if reluctant to break the spell. The air, previously thick with tension, now vibrated with an unspoken awe. He hadn't expected this reaction, this stunned silence. He'd expected derision, perhaps a smattering of polite applause. But this was something else entirely. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a gilded cage. The silence was a living thing, pressing against him, demanding something he wasn't sure he could give. He lowered his hands. The polished would cool against his skin, a grounding sensation in the swirling vortex of emotions. He hadn't played like that in years. The music had poured out of him, a torrent of suppressed emotions, of quiet defiance, of a yearning for something beyond the starched white of his uniform and the suffocating politeness of this gilded prison. A soft sigh escaped his lips, the barest exhalation of tension. He could feel the weight of countless gazes, some curious, some admiring, some still tinged with the same condescending amusement that had sparked this whole incident. He turned, his movements deliberate, almost robotic, and faced the room. The faces blurred into a sea of white, punctuated by the occasional splash of color, each a mask concealing a multitude of reactions. Except for one. Charles Wentworth III sat frozen, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The smug arrogance that had been so prominent just moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. His eyes, previously sharp and calculating, now held a flicker of something akin to fear. The carefully constructed facade of his social dominance had crumbled, revealing the insecure, petty man beneath. Malcolm felt a strange flicker of not pity, not exactly, perhaps a quiet satisfaction, a small, hard seed of triumph blooming in the desolate landscape of his usual resignation. The spell finally broke. A smattering of applause, hesitant at first, then growing in volume and enthusiasm, rippled through the room. Malcolm inclined his head, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. He didn't smile. He couldn't. The emotions churning within him were too complex, too raw. He turned and walked away from the piano, the spotlight fading as he retreated back into the shadows of his usual domain. The restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The murmur of conversations rose, the clinking of silverware resumed. The waiters moved with their practiced grace between the tables. But something had shifted, something intangible yet profound. The air was charged with a residual energy, a lingering echo of the music, of the defiance, of the moment when the carefully orchestrated performance of social hierarchy had been momentarily disrupted. Malcolm resumed his duties, his movements precise and efficient. He refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and attended to the needs of the diners with his usual quiet competence. But beneath the surface, a quiet storm raged. The music had awakened something within him, a dormant ember of passion and self-worth that he hadn't realized he'd lost. He felt different, stronger. At Charles Wentworth III's table, the older gentleman, the one who had earlier acknowledged Malcolm's presence with a nod, spoke, his voice low and measured. "Charles, my boy," he said, his tone laced with a subtle reprimand. "You've made a rather spectacular fool of yourself tonight." Charles flinched, his face flushing a dull crimson. He opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again, the words catching in his throat. He looked around the room, his gaze darting from face to face, searching for a glimmer of support, of understanding. But he found none, only a polite, almost clinical detachment. The carefully curated social tapestry he had woven around himself had been torn, revealing the threadbare fabric beneath. Malcolm paused at the edge of their table, his expression carefully neutral. He met Charles's gaze, his own eyes steady and unwavering. He didn't speak, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, with the echo of the music, with the weight of the shifted power dynamic. "Young man," the older gentleman said, his voice regaining its usual warmth as he turned to Malcolm. "That was remarkable, truly remarkable." Malcolm inclined his head again, the smallest of acknowledgments. "Real power," he said, his voice soft yet resonant, "isn't about humiliating others. It's about knowing your own worth, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise." He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the flow of the restaurant, leaving Charles Wentworth III to stew in the bitter dregs of his own humiliation. The clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversations, the soft strains of background music, all blended into a symphony of indifference, a testament to the transient nature of social spectacle. But in the quiet corners of the Whitmore room, in the hidden spaces of the heart, the echo of Malcolm's music lingered, a quiet reminder of the enduring power of self-respect, a testament to the enduring power of art to transcend the superficial and touch the soul.